excuse me. So, hold on. Sorry about that. So signification, the exchange of a thing for a dissimilar thing, the unification of the signifier and the signified into a whole sign. And this is in comparison to the value of a sign, which Saussure describes as the comparison of similar things, or as signs existing in systems of interdependent terms in which the value of each term results solely from the simultaneous presence of the others. So Saussure uses the example of the recto and the verso of a piece of paper. So the observable relation between different pieces A to D is distinct from the relation between the front and back of the same piece, as in A and its reverse, B and its reverse, and so on. So to understand the meaning of a sign, to so to say exhaust the meaning of a sign, you need to take into consideration or into account both its signification and its value. This is something that all semioticians we understand and we know. And it's a matter of difference. In sign systems, there are only differences. Difference implies positive terms between which the difference is set up. So at the level of the signifier and the signified, it's of course a little different than at the level of the entire sign. At the level of signifier and signified, there are differences without positive terms. And yes, I'm bombarding you with a bunch of Saussure citations, quotations that you can look at. But the idea is that you can speak about differential systems, systems of difference, value systems, systems of value. Value as such is something that is purely negative and differential. And what this implies, or what comes out of this, is that for all semiotic systems, sign systems, whatever terminology you prefer, relationality is more important than materiality. It's about the so-called reciprocal opposition within a fixed system, how the terms relate to each other, relation, difference, negative, positive, things like that. The materiality of the paper clip as opposed to the farmhouse, as opposed to a contract, a piece of paper, and so on. This is not what matters in semiotic systems or sign systems or value systems. And when he further describes the notion of value, Saussure invokes the economic analogy. So I'm not going to read this entire citation, but the point is, I'll read the first part. To determine what a 5-franc piece is worth, one must therefore know it can be exchanged for a fixed quantity of a different thing, such as bread, or it can be compared with a similar value of the same system, like a 1-franc piece, or with coins of another system, such as $1. In the same way, a word can be exchanged for something dissimilar, an idea, and so on and so forth. So again, an important distinction between signification and value. And when it comes to value specifically, Saussure invokes the economic analogy, economic systems. So this kind of led me to think about, is it possible to only, for the sake of convenience, for the expediency of analysis, to make this heuristic distinction between economic value and semiotic value? And of course, it's only heuristic because we can describe everything, so to say, semiotically. We can go to a higher meta level and describe economic systems as semiotic systems. So positing economic systems on kind of the same field as semiotic systems, again, it's only for convenience or expediency of an analysis or a description. But heuristically, I think there might be something here, so to say. So when we're talking about this distinction, an economic system, an economic value versus a semiotic system or a semiotic value, what kind of yardsticks can we use to measure it? What kind of gauges are there? What kind of things can we posit as base units or something like that? So to me, when we're talking about economic value or economic systems, we can try to measure it or understand it according to the concept of profit. And when we're talking about semiotic values, semiotic systems, and so on, we can try to gauge it in terms of the concept of meaning. And then this, the bottom half of the slide here, it's very preliminary, and I don't know if it holds fully yet. It's in need of further research and thought. But a linguistic examination, there's a kind of consonance between how we talk about profit and how we talk about meaning. So we speak about generating a profit or profit generation. And in literature, you also come across meaning generation, generating a meaning. The same thing with making a profit, making a meaning. The same thing with something like production, meaning production, producing a meaning. And then, of course, production is central to economic discourse. So there is a certain, what I call, consonance between the way that profit and meaning are used in natural language, in English. But there's also a kind of dissonance. So I have heard, creating a profit creation, but it's not as common as some of these other expressions. And then turning a profit is quite a common expression in English, but I've never heard, I don't think I've ever come across something like turning a meaning. So there is a certain dissonance as well, which is perhaps inroads to this heuristic distinction between economic and semiotic value. But again, this is very preliminary, tentative, and speculative, and in need of further refinement, further thought. So now we get to, I guess, this Semiosalong series is history and praxis. It is about history, historical change, diachrony, historical dynamics, things like that. So when we're talking about values in general, values change over time. And when I talk about in society and culture, and what I've here put as socioculture. So what does it mean for values to change over time? It means that value relations change over time. Value systems change over time. Economic systems obviously change. Cultural systems change. Linguistic systems change. These are all semiotic systems, value systems, relational systems, differential systems, whatever you want to call them. So for instance, Juri Lotman has this fantastic little article, a chapter called "The Dream, a Semiotic Window." And he discusses the role of dreams in culture. So in different cultures, dreams, in certain cultures, dreams have been ascribed a very important central role. And in these types of cultures, for instance, the shaman is, he is the authority of the culture, the authoritative voice, the authoritative source, and he is generally the dream interpreter. But in different cultures, for instance, later modern cultures, where there is a need for systematization, for organization, for technical progress and efficiency, dreams as communicative systems become secondary to, for instance, practical communications, to nowadays information technologies, things like that. So it's a kind of system between dreams as communicative systems and practical communications. The value relation has clearly changed over time. And of course, Michel Foucault, he had in Discipline and Punish, it's of course his fantastic wide-ranging treatise on the development of the prison, on the development of the criminal justice system, systems, again, relational systems of laws to laws, punishments to punishments, laws to punishments, and so on. And the rise of the prison in relation to other punishments. The prison is now central to criminal justice systems all over the world, but it wasn't always like that. In ancient Rome, they would put offenders into large sacks with snakes and dogs and bears and throw them into rivers. There was gladiatorial combat. There's been, the prison is actually a very, very new phenomenon in relation to other punishments. So again, this value system has changed. A more contemporary example would be film actors versus television actors. In the mid-20th century through 60s, 70s, 80s, film actors were ascribed a much higher status than television actors. And nowadays, even if they maybe are considered of a higher status still, it's graded, it has changed. And we talk about the golden age of television, we talk about movie stars going over to TV stars getting roles in film, the same with theatrical stars and so on. So again, a change in value. And you can think about hypothetical scenarios. Say we were to discover a new chemical element, it would change the value relation. For instance, on the periodic table, we would add something new to it that would change the system. But also there'd be, we would try to look for maybe its commercial benefits, what it could do for us. And then we would relate it to other elements, other technologies, other technical things. And again, this would be a change in value. So I guess the point of this slide, in society and culture, whether for practical, technological, or whatever other reasons, values over the course of historical time change. And we get to the study of values. So again, this distinction between economic and semiotic value, I believe, could be very useful heuristic analytical tool. So the study of economic value would be the so-called economic approach, and the study of semiotic value would be the so-called semiotic approach, obviously. So what these studies entail, it would be the semiotic approach, what a phenomenon means, and then you could link it to the concept of signification. In the economic approach, you could speak about how a phenomenon relates to profitability, and you could relate it to a concept such as inflation. So whether you're talking about dreams and culture and the issue of practicality, prison in the capitalistic society, the salaries and or statuses of actors, whether film, television, or theater, epistemological versus commercial dimensions of the discovery of a new element, whatever, these can be approached, in my opinion, possibly either economically or semiotically, so to say. And again, it's very important to keep in mind, this is only a heuristic analytical distinction. It's it's kind of an ideal typologization or something like that. And it's very important, of course, as researchers, we all know this intuitively, and we make it more or less explicit in our research to always differentiate, distinguish, discriminate between the object level and the meta level, what a value, how values exist, you know, in real life amongst the people, so to say, in the real world, as opposed to on this meta level and meta levels of scientific conception and research and thought and description. And here we get to, when you're speaking about values changing, we can just think about how society and culture, even over the past, I'd say 5 years, how our understanding of the world has really started to change. We've seen different types of sociocultural revolutions, and we've seen the rise of different types of concepts or conceptualizations to describe the world as it was, and the world as it is, and the world as it should be. We've begun to understand systemic discrimination, racism, sexism, homophobia. There's terms such as mansplaining, which links to patriarchal discourse. There's toxic culture, rape culture, mental health discourse, and so on. We have all of these different types of phenomena and sociocultural ways that we describe in terms of good and bad. And there's also, we describe beautiful and ugly things. There's concepts such as body shaming. We talk about not only systemic issues, but we talk about the nature of beauty. There's taste. There's things like that, and these are the domains of ethics and aesthetics, which are generally studied under the rubric or the domain of axiology. So these are what I would call axiological values. But these values, to me, it seems, belong to an entirely different category than the semiotic and economic values I've been describing up to this point. So we have 4 different types of values, and we have 2 different types of categories. And I would put these under the labels of description versus prescription. So when you're describing something, you're attempting to do something neutral. You're positing how things are, as opposed to prescribing, which is normative, which is saying how things should be or ought to be. So maybe there's a distinction to be made here between values and value judgments, but this is something for further refinement of terminology or meta language. And this description versus prescription idea was already kind of posited or described in the early 20th century by Max Weber, who, first off, he said the researcher always needs to keep in mind, when they're describing something, their own value-based worldview, and second, they also need to describe or remind their readers, the point at where the analyst ends and the so-called idealist begins. So this allows us to move towards a typologization of values: descriptive values, the economic and semiotic ones, and prescriptive values, the ethical and aesthetic ones. And this has very important scientific implications for the researcher. There's axiology, which could study the prescriptive values, and there's what Weber calls social philosophy, which for him is the domain that should study these prescriptive these descriptive values. So for Weber, economics could never be an ethical science built upon empirical foundations. It's an empirical science. What economics and all other sciences dedicated to the study of society and culture should do is describe. They should describe means ends reasoning. They should describe the underlying ideals and values and significances of a society or a culture, and this is social science. But prescribing correct means, ends, processes, prescribing what are considered the right ideals and values or the meanings that should be interpreted. This is a matter of social policy, and this is separate from social science. And it's very, very important for the scientist or the researcher to keep these things separate, because otherwise you get these conflated, confused, unclear research products that they blend description and prescription. So you always have to differentiate three components: practicality, if what you're describing or prescribing could be useful for achieving some goal, whether you're doing an analysis, what he calls the ordering of empirical reality, or whether you're writing something that's based on your own conscientiousness, which is inherently prescriptive. So to conclude, with very obvious, and again, this was kind of a haphazard, speculative, tentative study, a tentative talk, but yeah, some conclusions that values, whether semiotic, economic, ethical, aesthetic, they change over time. They change historically. This is quite obvious, but they are possible to typologize, and they are possible to use in research with careful consideration. Again, keeping in mind which category you're ascribing to, what you're applying it to, what level you're applying it to, etc. And so, for example, I think something very interesting and important to study would be approach from any one of these types of values. You can approach this system semiotically, economically, ethically, aesthetically, the commodification of human beings. So we live in a time where, of course, slavery is unacceptable. It should have, always been unacceptable, but it wasn't. But slavery as such, the exchange of human beings for money or human beings for other human beings and so on, it still lives on very fragmented and in very different ways. But for example, in professional sports where human beings are commodified because they can kick a ball really well or something, and they're exchanged for millions and millions of dollars, and they lose their humanity, they're dehumanized. You could approach the red paperclip structure from the same way, according to any of these value systems, keeping in mind diachronic, synchronic aspects of analysis and so on. So again, to conclude, values change, they're possible to typologize, they're possible to use in research, and they're possible to apply to contemporary sociocultural phenomena. Thank you very much for listening. I hope, again, that the audience got something out of it, and here are my references. So thank you.
So thanks a lot. So we have time for questions now. If there are questions here, would you come here and post your question here to the microphone? Are there questions here from the audience?
Hey, Erik, excellent talk.
Thank you very much.
And maybe can you say something? Is there a connection between the difference between use value and exchange value and prescriptive versus descriptive?
I guess, thank you very much, Tyler, for that question. That's a good question. I think maybe use value and exchange value are things that you could approach you could posit them as these separate categories, and you could approach them via these other types of values. So for example, Kyle McDonald, the guy who did all of the red paperclip exchanges, he said that he was offered a lot of very bizarre, he had a lot of very bizarre offers. So for example, one of the things that he really struggled with, and he rejected this offer immediately, but it bothered him for a long time. Somebody offered him their virginity in exchange for one of the objects that he had. And to him, this was wrong. And you could look at a lot of the exchanges he made and maybe the motivations behind them. Why did the people want to do that? Why would they find this thing useful? Why did they want to make the exchange? And now you can approach it aesthetically. Did they just like the way that something looked? Ethically, did they want to use this for good or for bad? So should he make that exchange? Semiotically, just what does that mean to make that trade? Is something, how can you say that something's bigger or better? You have to look at oppositions and distinctive features and things like that. Or economically, is the thing you're trading really worth more in the monetary or financial sense than it is in the other way? So yeah, when you talk about use value or exchange value, I think these can be approached by these other value categories, if that makes sense.
Yeah. But so like semiotic value, you want to say the semiotic value is purely differential value with Saussure, right? And that therefore the prescriptive is non-differential and therefore non-semiotic.
No, I guess, again, I wouldn't say that. I'd say, like, from the higher meta level, it's obviously everything is semiotic and relational and differential and negative and so on. It's just prescription it's this different kind of mode. It adds this layer of subjectivity, of personal opinion, of belief, of how things should be, which Weber really, he stresses that we can describe the underlying ideals and significances of a society or a culture, but it's not a part of science. We're not policy. We shouldn't tell the people what they should do with this knowledge now. You have this knowledge, but this knowledge is up to your own personality, your own character, your own individuality, your own sense of right and wrong. And that's something that's outside of science proper. So I wouldn't say that it's not a semiotic system, but I'd say that you should conceptualize it differently.
Sure. Excellent. Our next speaker, by the way, knows something about descriptive versus explanatory frameworks, and I'll be interested to see if he can try to connect it to your discussion of value. But anyway, so further.
Great,
questions?
thank you. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. And so we have a question in Zoom. So Anna, please.
Hey, everyone, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so Erik, great presentation. I really enjoyed it, but I have two quick questions for you actually. So according to you, let's say the semiotic value. So if we take it from, I don't know, 1950s to today, which factors affected the change in value, let's say from this past moment to today, to the contemporary semiotic value? What do you think, which factors influenced those changes the most in the value?
Well, first off, Anna, nice to hear from you. Thank you very much for your question. So just in general, why semiotic values change, I guess, we have all sorts of different, we have all sorts of different sign systems, different semiotic systems, whether it's this very localized red paperclip structure to cultural systems, social systems, whatever. And the reasons that they change over time, they're dynamic systems. They change for whatever reason, which is very, very specific to that particular system. Lotman's written about how, for instance, fashion changes very quickly, natural language changes very slowly. So the dynamics of these specific systems is really dependent on all sorts of different influential mitigating factors within the semiosphere. But I would say in general, just like the fact that semiotic systems change can be, external, the discovery of some new element that gets incorporated into the system. There's matters of internal dynamics, which for whatever reason the system evolves. So when you're talking about change in semiotic systems or semiotic values, it's really just the point is that values do indeed change, whether they do it more slowly or quicker, dependent on the specific system. So I don't know if I fully answered your question, but I guess the main idea that I was trying to express or pass forward was that we do exist in a big meta system of value systems, and the values change over time, and that's why culture is such a dynamic entity.
Okay, yeah, thank you. That was a really good answer. Also, another question. So when you mentioned this Lotman's article about the dreams, so then I started thinking how dreams itself can also have this value. Let's say when I read Freud and Jung, of course, the Freud mentions dreams are this royal pathway to the subconscious, they're these reflections of our desires, our wishes, our thoughts. So do you think that dreams actually present this value of each individual?
Well, thanks for the next question. That's a really interesting one. I really suggest reading that chapter. I think it's in Culture and Explosion. It's a really short one, but that was the belief. Lotman writes about it in the article. That was the belief that he said dreams were the father of all semiotic processes or something like that. And he says that it's interesting to posit a dream as a value system. He said that dreams are very difficult in them to distinguish the isolated elements. So in that sense, if you're trying to reconstruct a dream as a kind of value relational system and make it discrete, it's such a continuous system that it's very difficult to do so. But yes, he does mention, he says that the Freudian and the shaman as interpreters, they have the exact amount of validity, the same amount of status one to another, because it's all about interpretation. It's all about trying to create value. It's all about using the dream to understand yourself, to get introspection, to go deeper into these personal, psychological, subjective processes. So in that sense, dreams as so-called like value builders or personality describers or self-descriptions, that's Lotman says that's an entirely valid way of understanding them, and that's actually what was the function of dreams in more ancient cultures. So again, I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, thank you. You answered it well. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Do we have questions from the audience here? Because if not, I have something as like a question or a comment. But so I liked your presentation a lot, Erik. But I wanted to point out just very briefly that this, well, as you know, all these exegesis, how is it in English? Exegesis of Saussure, it's a very problematic thing. And when it comes to these economic analogies, there are many sort of versions, but there is this book by John Joseph, about Saussure, and there, because as you know, there is some talk about Saussure being influenced by some sociologists, sometimes by Durkheim and so on, but this is not very clear. And the whole point of Joseph's book is to, and well, not only Joseph's, but Kerner before Joseph, it was to reconstruct Saussure from its sort of immediate environment. And in this respect, it becomes really interesting that one of his brothers, René de Saussure, he proposed, he was involved in economics, and he proposed a sort of international currency that was sort of parallel to Esperanto, and the currency was spesmilo. But well, I think it didn't really get approved. But in any case, it's interesting to also to see the history of the notion of value inside of Saussure's own thinking. So that was the comment. The question was, you ended your talk with this sort of problem of commodification, or like to turn something into a commodity. However, I was thinking about the fact that it seems to me that meaning, it's always created, or it sort of involves, and meaning and value, so they involve practices. Oh, sorry, practices. And sometimes these practices are not necessarily something bad, but just you know, it's just the way in which we use sounds. They define their value, but we use them in a practice. So where would this limit be between practice that is needed for meaning to arrive and this sort of commodification of things? So it is a tricky question, and yeah. So
yeah, well, first off, yeah, thank you very much for the comment and the question. The comment is super fascinating that maybe in Saussure's inner circles there was actually attempts to simultaneously construct economic linguistic systems, or at least understandings of them. So that's really fascinating, and thank you for that, because I think it adds another entire dimension to this research. And as for your question, I guess I'll try to frame it in the sense of, or try to understand it in the sense of, so Weber makes the differentiation between when you're looking at society or culture, that you can, something will strike you that hits your conscience. And this is kind of the ethical prescriptive side. And then there's something that hits your logic. And this is the descriptive epistemological side. But then there's also, he does explicitly posit this category of practicality. And so he says that the social scientists should not, try to prescribe their own ideals. They should just try to describe empirical reality. But there's this, it's almost like a middle part. Like the practical component is the researcher can describe how a society or a culture is doing something in practice. They can analyze it, but then they can also prescribe to them how to do things better. For instance, how to better achieve a welfare system. So sociologists can say you should do this to have a better welfare system. And this is prescriptive, but it's based on description, but it's a type of prescription not necessarily based on an ethical ideal. It's something based in practicality. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but the idea here is that the practical dimension or the practical component is like this third part that kind of problematizes or challenges this very strict dichotomy between the prescriptive and the descriptive. So I'd say your question is problematic because it introduces the problematic component into my very simplified opposition. So I don't know if that answered it, but thank you.
No, thank you. And so we still have some time, like if there is a quick question from people here in the audience. No? Okay, so then Erik, thanks a lot. Thank you very much. And
no, thank you, and thanks everyone.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. And so, now that